In the dead of night, when shadows dance between the bare trees of Wisconsin, there exists a truth so horrifying that even 68 years later, the residents of Plainfield still whisper about it in hushed tones, their voices trembling like autumn leaves caught in an endless wind. On November 16, 1957, the world discovered that monsters don't always hide under beds or lurk in forests. Sometimes they live next door, tending their gardens, feeding their chickens, and smiling at neighbors who never suspect that behind those weathered farmhouse walls lies a nightmare so profound it would rewrite the very definition of human evil. The name, Edward Theodore Gein, echoes through the corridors of American horror like a funeral bell that never stops ringing. But what you think you know about Ed Gein is merely the sanitized version. The story filtered through decades of police reports that omitted the most disturbing details, newspaper accounts that danced around the unspeakable truth, and Hollywood adaptations that turned genuine terror into marketable entertainment. Tonight, we descend into the real story, the one that was buried beneath layers of bureaucratic silence, small-town shame, and a collective decision to forget what cannot be forgotten. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, where are you watching this from and what time is it there? Because after tonight, you'll remember exactly where you were when you learned the truth about what happened in that isolated farmhouse where madness wore the mask of mourning, and love became indistinguishable from obsession. The wind still carries secrets across the flatlands of central Wisconsin, where time moves differently and the past refuses to stay buried. In the 1950s, Plainfield was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where unlocked doors were the norm, and where the most scandalous news might involve someone's prize cow wandering into a neighbor's cornfield. The population barely reached 600 souls, scattered across dairy farms and small businesses that had survived the Great Depression through stubborn determination and quiet faith. It was a place where people believed in hard work, Christian values, and the simple truth that good neighbors looked out for one another. But isolation has a way of breeding strange fruit, and in the heart of this seemingly innocent landscape lived a man whose relationship with death had begun long before anyone realized the depths of his descent into darkness. Edward Gein was born in 1906 to Augusta and George Gein, and from his first breath he was caught between two opposing forces that would ultimately tear his sanity apart like paper in a storm. His father, George, was a weak man who drowned his failures in alcohol, spending his days in taverns while his family struggled to maintain their 160-acre farm. But it was Augusta who truly shaped the boy's destiny. Augusta, whose fierce religious convictions and pathological hatred of the outside world would plant seeds of madness that would bloom decades later in ways no one could have imagined. Augusta Gein was a woman possessed by righteous fury, convinced that the world beyond their farm was a cesspool of sin and corruption that would contaminate her sons if given the chance. She homeschooled Edward and his older brother Henry, filling their young minds with fire and brimstone sermons about the wickedness of women, the evil lurking in every human heart, and the absolute necessity of remaining pure in an impure world. She read to them from the Bible every evening, her voice rising and falling like a preacher, as she described the torments awaiting those who strayed from God's path, but her interpretations were filtered through a mind that saw demons in every shadow and sin in every smile. The Gein farmhouse became a fortress against the outside world, its windows covered with heavy curtains that blocked out not just light, but any connection to the community beyond. Augusta permitted no visitors, no friends, no relationships that might weaken her control over her sons' souls. She painted pictures of women as vessels of temptation, creatures designed by the devil to lead good men into damnation, and she made her boys swear sacred oaths that they would never marry, never leave her, never allow the corruption of flesh to poison their spirits. Edward, smaller and more sensitive than his brother, absorbed these lessons like a sponge soaking up poison, his young mind unable to distinguish between maternal protection and psychological imprisonment. When George Gein died in 1940, his passing was mourned by no one and celebrated by Augusta, who saw his death as divine intervention, removing a source of weakness from their sacred home. Henry, who had begun to question their mother's teachings and express interest in the world beyond the farm, met his end 4 years later under circumstances that remain suspicious to this day. The official cause of death was listed as asphyxiation from smoke during a brush fire, but Henry's body was found in an area untouched by flames, with unexplained head injuries that suggested violence rather than accident. Edward, who had been with his brother that day, claimed they had become separated in the smoke, but neighbors noticed how quickly he led searchers to Henry's body, how calm he remained while describing his brother's final moments, and how his story changed with each telling. With Henry gone, Edward was left alone with Augusta, and their relationship deepened into something that transcended normal mother-son bonds and entered territory that psychiatrists would later struggle to categorize. They were no longer simply family. They had become a closed system, a universe of two that revolved around shared prayers, shared fears, and a shared conviction that they were the last righteous people in a world rushing toward apocalypse. Augusta's health began to fail, but her grip on Edward's psyche only tightened, as if she was pouring the essence of her being into his receptive mind, ensuring that her influence would survive even when her body could not. The first stroke came in 1945, leaving Augusta partially paralyzed but still mentally sharp enough to continue her psychological domination of her son. Edward nursed her with devotion that bordered on worship, feeding her, bathing her, reading to her from the scriptures that had shaped both their worldviews. He prayed over her nightly, begging God to heal her, promising to sacrifice anything if only she could remain with him forever. The second stroke in December 1945 finally silenced Augusta's voice, but by then, Edward's mind had already begun its final descent into a darkness where love and death, devotion and obsession, mother and son would merge into something that defied all human understanding. The silence that fell over the Gein farmhouse after Augusta's death was not the peaceful quiet of grief, but the terrible stillness that precedes a storm. Edward, now 39 years old and completely alone for the first time in his life, sealed off the rooms his mother had used, preserving them exactly as they were on the day she died. Her bedroom became a shrine, her kitchen a museum, her sitting room a temple where he would kneel and pray for hours, sometimes through entire nights, his voice echoing through empty halls as he begged for forgiveness, for guidance, for some sign that she was still with him. But preservation was not enough for a mind unhinged by loss and isolation. Edward began to develop what he would later describe as an irresistible urge to be close to his mother again, to touch her skin, to hear her voice, to feel the warmth of her presence. When prayer failed to bring her back, when the Bible offered no comfort for his unbearable loneliness, he began to seek other means of reunion, methods that would have horrified the righteous woman who had raised him, but which seemed, to his fractured psyche, like the logical extension of eternal love. The first violation occurred on a cold December night in 1947, 2 years after Augusta's death, when Edward crept through the darkness to Plainfield Cemetery and unearthed the grave of a recently buried middle-aged woman whose obituary he had read in the local paper. Using tools borrowed from his farm, he carefully excavated the coffin, opened it with trembling hands, and gazed upon flesh that had not yet surrendered completely to decay. What happened next in that frozen cemetery remains known only to Edward and the dead, but he would later confess that touching that corpse brought him a sense of peace he had not felt since his mother's passing, a connection to death that somehow made life bearable again. This was not necrophilia in any conventional sense, though investigators would struggle to find adequate terms for Edward's relationship with the dead. He was not driven by sexual desire, but by something far more complex and infinitely more disturbing, a need to possess death itself, to own it, to make it a part of his daily existence. Over the following months, he returned to that cemetery again and again, always under cover of darkness, always choosing graves of women who resembled his mother in age and build. He developed techniques for quick excavation, methods for preserving flesh, ways of transporting his prizes back to the farm without detection. But even the comfort of cemetery visits could not fill the growing void in Edward's soul. The dead were silent companions, offering presence without conversation, flesh without warmth, love without reciprocation. As the months passed and his isolation deepened, Edward began to fantasize about more complete forms of communion, relationships that would bridge the gap between life and death, between himself and the mother whose absence had become the defining fact of his existence. The transformation of the Gein farmhouse from family home to charnel house began slowly, almost imperceptibly, as Edward brought his cemetery treasures inside and began treating them not as corpses, but as houseguest companions, who would keep him company during the long Wisconsin winters when snow buried the farm in white silence, and the only sounds were wind through broken shutters and the settling of old wood. He would sit with his collection through entire nights, sometimes reading aloud from his mother's Bible, sometimes simply talking about his day, sharing memories of Augusta and expressing hopes for their eventual reunion. But flesh, even preserved flesh, has its limitations, and Edward's needs were evolving in directions that cemetery visits could not satisfy. He began to study his collection with the intensity of a scholar learning the properties of skin and bone, discovering which parts of the human body retained their integrity longest after death, experimenting with techniques for preservation that drew upon both his farm experience with animal carcasses and his growing obsession with human anatomy. The first living victim was Bernice Worden, owner of Worden's hardware store in Plainfield, a 58-year-old widow who had shown kindness to Edward during his occasional trips to town for supplies. On November 16, 1957, she was working alone in her store when Edward entered, ostensibly to purchase antifreeze for his truck. What transpired in those final moments of Bernice Worden, as life remains known only through Edward's confused and contradictory confessions, but the physical evidence would paint a picture of violence that shocked even hardened investigators. When Bernice's son, Frank, returned to the store that evening and found his mother missing with blood pooled on the floor and the cash register emptied, he immediately contacted Sheriff Art Schley, who began canvassing local residents for information about suspicious activities. Edward's name surfaced quickly. He had been seen in the store earlier that day, and his awkward demeanor had struck several witnesses as unusual even by his standards. But nothing could have prepared Sheriff Schley and his deputies for what they would discover when they arrived at the Gein farm that night, carrying flashlights and search warrants expecting to find evidence of robbery and perhaps assault. The first indication that something was terribly wrong came from the smell, a sweet, cloying odor that seemed to seep from the very walls of the farmhouse, growing stronger as they approached the kitchen. Deputy Daniel Chase would later describe it as the smell of death multiplied by time, and stench so overpowering that several officers had to step outside to vomit before continuing their search. But it was not just the smell that disturbed them. It was the silence, the absolute stillness that filled the house like thick fog, broken only by the sound of their own breathing and the creak of floorboards beneath their feet. Sheriff Schley pushed open the kitchen door with the barrel of his flashlight, and the beam illuminated a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Hanging from the ceiling, suspended by ropes that had been threaded through the ankle tendons, was the headless, gutted corpse of Bernice Worden, dressed and cleaned like a deer prepared for butchering. But this was no animal carcass. This was a human being, a woman they had all known, transformed into something that belonged in a slaughterhouse rather than a kitchen. The discovery of Bernice Worden's body was only the beginning of a night that would redefine the boundaries of human horror. As the officers spread throughout the house, their flashlights revealed artifact after artifact that suggested a mind completely divorced from reality, a consciousness that had long ago abandoned any distinction between the living and the dead, between love and possession, between preservation and desecration. Police report. Plainfield Sheriff's Department, November 17, 1957. Kitchen inventory reveals 4 noses in a cup, 9 death masks fashioned from human faces, bowls crafted from human skulls, 10 female heads with tops sawed off, human head in a paper bag, human head in a burlap sack, 9 death masks, skull with saw marks. Note: Officer Johnson required medical attention after discovery of refrigerated human heart. In the sitting room, they found chairs upholstered with human skin, their surfaces tanned and treated with the care usually reserved for fine leather. Lampshades had been crafted from faces, their features still recognizable despite the preservation process. A shoebox contained a collection of human noses, carefully arranged like precious jewelry. Another box held 9 masks made from the skin of women's faces, each one peeled away with surgical precision and preserved through techniques that Edward had perfected over years of experimentation. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the discovery of Augusta's room, which Edward had kept exactly as it was on the day she died 12 years earlier. Her bed was still made with the same sheets, her clothes still hung in the closet, her Bible remained open to the passage she had been reading before her final stroke. Yet scattered throughout this shrine to maternal memory were fragments of other women. Strips of skin used as bookmarks, pieces of bone incorporated into the room's decoration, photographs of the dead women whose bodies had provided the raw materials for Edward's grotesque art. Wisconsin Bureau of Investigation, November 18, 1957. Evidence includes complete human skin suit, designed to be worn, belt crafted from female nipples, leggings fashioned from human leg skin, multiple human skulls used as bowls and containers. Classification restricted, not for public disclosure. The skin suit was perhaps the most revealing artifact of all, a complete human hide that had been carefully sewn together from multiple victims, designed to be worn like clothing. When confronted with this evidence, Edward would later explain that he had created it in order to become his mother, to literally wear her skin, and thus achieve the reunion that death had denied them. But Augusta's body had long since decomposed beyond use, forcing Edward to create his suit from surrogates women who resembled her in build and coloring victims who had been chosen not for who they were, but for how closely they matched his idealized memory of maternal perfection. The investigation revealed that Edward had been active for far longer than anyone had suspected. In addition to Bernice Worden, he confessed to the murder of Mary Hogan, a tavern owner, who had disappeared 3 years earlier, though he claimed to remember few details of that killing beyond a vague recollection of needing her for his collection. But the physical evidence suggested many more victims. Women whose disappearances had been attributed to voluntary departures or accidents, but whose remains may have ended up in Edward Seahude's House of Horrors. Deputy Chase discovered detailed journals hidden in the basement, handwritten accounts of Edward's activities that revealed the systematic nature of his crimes. The entries, written in a neat, careful script that belied their horrific contents, described his cemetery excavations with the precision of a scientist documenting experiments. He had kept careful records of which graves he had violated, which bodies had provided the best materials for his projects, which preservation techniques had proven most effective. Personal Journal, Edward Gein, entry dated April 15, 1953. Mother came to me in dreams again last night. She showed me how to make the skin soft, how to keep it from cracking. She says I'm getting closer to the truth, closer to understanding what she needs from me. The new face fits better than the last one. Soon, I'll be ready. But as investigators delved deeper into Edward's psychology through hours of interrogation, a more complex picture emerged, one that transcended simple madness and entered territory that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of love, loss, and human identity. Edward insisted with childlike sincerity that he had never intended to hurt anyone, that his actions had been motivated not by hatred or perversion, but by overwhelming love for his deceased mother and a desperate need to maintain connection with her spirit. Dr. Milton Rayner, the psychiatrist assigned to evaluate Edward's mental state, would later describe him as the most genuinely confused individual I have ever encountered. A man whose internal reality had become so divorced from external truth that he seemed genuinely bewildered by the horror his actions had inspired in others. Edward spoke of his victims with tenderness, referring to them as friends who had helped him in his quest to reunite with Augusta, and he expressed genuine sadness when told that his activities had frightened the community. The trial that followed was a study in the inadequacy of legal frameworks when confronted with crimes that seemed to exist outside normal categories of human behavior. Edward was declared legally insane and committed to Waupun State Hospital, but the question of what to do with the evidence, the artifacts he had created from human remains, proved more challenging. Many items were destroyed, immediately burned in hospital incinerators while investigators watched in silence. But rumors persisted that certain pieces had been secretly preserved, stored in government facilities where they remain to this day, studied by researchers seeking to understand the psychology of extreme isolation and maternal obsession. The house itself became a pilgrimage site for the morbidly curious, drawing visitors from across the country who wanted to see the place where such horrors had occurred. But the attention proved too much for the residents of Plainfield, who had spent generations building a reputation as a peaceful farming community, and now found themselves famous for producing America's most notorious killer. In March 1958, the Gein farmhouse mysteriously caught fire and burned to the ground, the flames consuming not just the building but any remaining evidence of Edward's activities. Memo: Wisconsin Bureau of Investigation, March 20, 1958. Fire investigation inconclusive. No evidence of arson detected, but circumstances remain suspicious. Local officials express relief that attraction has been eliminated. Certain photographic evidence previously cataloged is now missing from evidence storage. Investigation into missing materials ongoing. Yet the destruction of physical evidence could not erase the psychological impact of Edward's crimes on both the local community and the broader American consciousness. The case challenged comfortable assumptions about the nature of evil, forcing people to confront the possibility that monsters might arise not from inherent wickedness, but from isolation, grief, and love twisted beyond recognition. Edward had not killed for pleasure or profit, but out of a desperate need to maintain connection with the most important person in his life, a woman whose death had left him adrift in a world he had never learned to navigate alone. The residents of Plainfield struggled to reconcile their memories of Edward as a quiet, harmless neighbor with the revelation of what he had been doing behind the closed doors of his farmhouse. Many reported feeling guilty for not recognizing signs of his deteriorating mental state, though psychiatrists would later confirm that Edward had been exceptionally skilled at maintaining normal appearances during his rare interactions with the community. His madness had been entirely private, contained within the walls of his home where no witness existed save the dead. Some of Edward's neighbors began to question their own memories, wondering whether signs had been present that they had simply failed to recognize or chose to ignore. Had his increasingly erratic behavior during trips to town been cries for help that went unheeded? Had his obvious loneliness been an opportunity for intervention that the community had missed? The guilt and self-doubt that followed these revelations would persist for decades, passed down through families like an inherited trauma that shaped how parents spoke to their children about strangers, about isolation, about the importance of community vigilance. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Edward Gein case was not the crimes themselves, but the glimpse they provided into the human capacity for self-deception when confronted with unbearable loss. Edward's actions, however grotesque, followed a certain internal logic. If death had separated him from his mother, then he would master death, possess it, make it serve his needs rather than accepting its finality. His crimes were not random acts of violence, but systematic attempts to solve the fundamental problem of human mortality through the application of will and determination. Dr. Rayner's psychiatric evaluations revealed that Edward had constructed an elaborate internal mythology in which his actions were not violations of social norms, but religious observances, rituals designed to honor his mother's memory and prepare for their eventual reunion in whatever realm awaited beyond death. He spoke of his preserved victims as angels, who had been chosen to help him in his sacred work, and he expressed genuine bewilderment when told that their families mourned their passing rather than celebrating their elevation to divine service. The deeper investigators probed into Edward's psychology, the more they realized that traditional categories of mental illness were inadequate to explain his condition. He was not psychotic in any conventional sense. He maintained clear awareness of his surroundings and could engage in rational conversation about topics unrelated to his crimes. Nor was he a psychopath, lacking the manipulative cunning and emotional coldness typically associated with that condition. Instead, he seemed to exist in a category all his own, a man whose grief had evolved into something that transcended normal human experience and entered territory that seemed almost supernatural in its intensity. During his years at Waupun State Hospital, Edward became a subject of fascination for researchers studying the relationship between extreme isolation and psychological deterioration. His case was cited in dozens of academic papers, analyzed through multiple theoretical frameworks, and used as evidence for various theories about the development of antisocial behavior. But those who worked with him directly often reported a sense of profound sadness rather than fear, describing him as a man-child lost in a world too complex for his damaged psyche to navigate. Edward himself seemed to age rapidly once removed from his familiar environment, his hair turning white within months of his institutionalization, his body shrinking as if the absence of his beloved farmhouse was literally consuming him from within. He spoke frequently about wanting to return home, not seeming to understand that his home no longer existed, that it had been deliberately destroyed to prevent others from experiencing the horror he had created there. When told about the fire, he wept not for the building itself, but for the friends he believed were still inside, the preserved remains of his victims whom he had come to regard as family. The question of what Edward Gein truly was, madman, monster, or tragic figure, would continue to divide experts for decades after his crimes were discovered. Some saw him as proof that evil could emerge from the most unlikely sources, that the capacity for horror existed within all humans and needed only the right circumstances to manifest. Others viewed him as a victim himself, a damaged individual whose crimes were the inevitable result of psychological abuse and social isolation, rather than inherent wickedness. But for the residents of Plainfield, such academic debates provided little comfort as they struggled to rebuild their sense of community in the aftermath of revelations that had shattered their faith in their ability to know and trust their neighbors. The case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of isolation, the importance of mental health intervention, and the responsibility of communities to care for their most vulnerable members before tragedy strikes. Years passed, and Edward Gein faded from newspaper headlines, replaced by newer horrors and fresher scandals. But his influence on American culture proved far more lasting than anyone could have predicted. His story became the inspiration for fictional killers who would terrify audiences in movies like Psycho, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and The Silence of the Lambs, though these Hollywood interpretations sanitized and sensationalized his crimes, transforming genuine tragedy into entertainment that bore little resemblance to the complex reality of his psychological condition. The real Edward Gein spent his final years in quiet obscurity, largely forgotten by a world that had moved on to other concerns. He died in 1984 at the Mendota Mental Health Institute, his passing noted by few beyond the staff who had cared for him during his final decades. His grave, unmarked and deliberately obscure, became a destination for curiosity seekers who came seeking some connection to infamy, but they found only a small patch of grass that offered no insight into the man buried beneath. Yet, questions about Edward Gein persist, mysteries that may never be fully resolved. How many victims did he actually claim? What happened to the missing evidence that disappeared from police storage? Were there others in Plainfield who suspected his activities but chose to remain silent? And perhaps most troubling of all, in a world where isolation and mental illness continue to plague vulnerable individuals, how many potential Edward Geins exist among us today struggling with losses and obsessions that could, under the right circumstances, transform them into monsters? The farmhouse may have burned, the evidence may have been destroyed, and Edward himself may have died in obscurity, but the legacy of those terrible nights in November 1957 continues to haunt not just Plainfield, but the American imagination. His story serves as a reminder that horror doesn't always announce itself with dramatic flourishes. Sometimes it hides behind ordinary facades, grows quietly in isolated places, and emerges only when it's too late to prevent the damage it leaves behind. In the end, Edward Gein's greatest crime may not have been the murders he committed or the graves he violated, but the way his story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of love, loss, and the human need for connection. His actions, however reprehensible, arose from emotions that all humans experience: grief for the dead, longing for reunion with lost loved ones, and the desperate desire to hold on to what we cannot bear to lose. The horror of Edward Gein lies not in his difference from the rest of humanity, but in his similarity to us, in the recognition that under the right circumstances, love itself can become monstrous. Was it madness that drove Edward Gein to transform his farmhouse into a charnel house? Or was it design, the inevitable result of a mind shaped by isolation, trauma, and an understanding of love so absolute that it recognized no boundaries, not even death itself? The answer may lie buried with him in that unmarked grave, but the question continues to echo across the flatlands of Wisconsin, carried on winds that still whisper secrets the living were never meant to hear. If this story made you question reality, share it before it disappears. And subscribe, not for entertainment, but for truth. Some stories were never meant to be told, but now that you've heard it, there's no way to unhear it.